Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Juliet Sorensen. I'm a clinical professor of law here at Northwestern, associated with our Center for International Human Rights, which is one of the co-hosts of today's event, along with the Buffett Institute. The Northwestern Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs aims to foster meaningful engagement across borders of all kinds. And our host, the Central Asia Institute, which aims to promote education and livelihood skills, especially for girls and women in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. I hardly need tell you that our gathering today falls just over 2 years after the Taliban's swift takeover of Afghanistan and the US's hasty withdrawal from that country following an intensive 20-year presence. Since that time, the Taliban has reneged on promises to rule justly and respect human rights, instead imposing increasingly harsh restrictions on girls and women in particular. I'm joined today by distinguished panelists, but before I introduce them to you all, we're going to set the stage by grounding ourselves in the real world experience of women and girls in Afghanistan with a clip from Martin Smith's America and the Taliban docuseries from PBS FRONTLINE.
For 20 years after America toppled the Taliban, girls in Afghanistan were able to attend school. They could dream of careers as doctors and lawyers, seek office in government, become engineers or journalists, become leaders. For a while, the American project brought real progress. Initially, after taking power, the Taliban said they also supported girls' education. But then, in short order, they banned girls from attending school above the 6th grade. They said it was temporary. And in March 2022, as a new semester was about to begin, the Taliban announced that schools were going to open. After waiting nearly 7 months, teachers and students headed off to school on a Wednesday morning. Upon arrival, they learned that the Taliban had reversed their decision. Everyone was ordered to go home. This is the minister here? Yeah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. A month later, I met with Kandahar's director of education. There was the expectation that girls would go back to school. And then, suddenly, there was a reversal. I wanted to know why the Taliban had reneged on their promises.
Afghanistan خو یو هیواد دی، یو مذهب دی، یو دین دی. نو دا تقریبا چې دا ګرد سره مقایسه کوو او دا ګردو ته یو طرز العمل جوړیږي. دا یقینا ټکی پر ټکی د اسلام د نگاه څخه، د مذهب د نگاه څخه، د کلتور عنعناتو د نگاه څخه دا تقریبا وخت نیسي.
Why are all these decisions made by men?
دین مبین اسلام و نر ته پر ښځې باندې فضیلت ورکړی دی. نو دا هغه شان دي چې په دې کې عقل نه ځایېږي. دا الهي فیصلې دي.
Restrictions have only gotten worse. Women are now banned from most workplaces, should be chaperoned when traveling far from home, and are ordered to fully cover from head to toe. Defiant women risking arrest have taken to the streets. Monisa Mubarak, who used to work as a policy director at the Ministry of Finance, is one of them. She says the risks are necessary.
مبارزه آسیب داره، فداکاری داره، یا کشته میشی یا پیروز میشی. این گپا را باید در یاد داشته باشیم. حداقل یک تصویری از حکومت طالبان، از زندگی زنای افغان تحت حاکمیت طالبان را برای دنیا تقدیم کردیم.
These women, these heroes, I would say, who are demonstrating on the street of Kabul, they literally put their lives on the line.
Hey, 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 hey! Calm down!
But not just themselves, their families, their loved ones. This is the most heroic act.
In December 2022, the Taliban would go even further. Women would be prohibited from attending university. Zara, a name we are using to protect her identity, hoped to one day become a doctor. She spoke out just months after the Taliban took over.
بیغم باشیم. ما باز هم درس میخوانیم، بازم با آینده انشالله در خانه. هیچ فرق نمیکنه که این خو یک اتاق است. علم در اینجا است، در قلب است. ما انشالله کوشش میکنیم در اینجا نه، در خانه خود. در خانه نه، اگر خانه هم نمیمونه در یک اتاق. اگر اتاق من در چشم بسته ما درس میخوام. مرا هیچ کس استاد کرده نمیتونه، مرا هیچ کس نگفته نمیتونه که تو درس نخوان.
So, during today's discussion, we will explore the new realities of Afghanistan in the 21st century, the lives, the hopes, the future of women and girls, with the experts who have joined me today. So, first, immediately to my left, in the middle, Najia Mahmodi is a lawyer focused on violence against women, gender, and the elimination of gender-based violence. She is an expert with over 5 years of experience in prosecution, legal affairs, and international law practice in Afghanistan. She earned her law degree from the American University of Afghanistan and has participated in legal trainings overseas. And Najia is now my colleague and our LLM student at Northwestern Law School. Martin Smith, whose voice and image you saw in the clip just now, has covered the world in 40 years of producing and reporting from local to global, from the fall of communism in Russia to the rise of Al-Qaeda. And America and the Taliban is his latest docuseries for PBS FRONTLINE. He has won, by the way, every award it's possible to win in television. Not one but 4 DuPont Columbia Gold Batons, not one but 5 Peabody Awards, and not one but 8 Emmys. Last but hardly least, and immediately to my left, Alice Thomas is the executive director of the Central Asia Institute. She's an attorney by training and a champion of social justice and gender rights, and has more than 2 decades of experience working in international development and human rights, from responding to refugee crises to conflict-ridden countries and pressing global challenges such as poverty, education, weak governance, and climate change. Alice has dedicated her professional life to advocacy on behalf of marginalized and disenfranchised populations. There will be time at the conclusion of our conversation for questions, so if they occur to you during our conversation, please keep them up here, and I promise that you'll have the opportunity to pose them. And that goes for you too, folks out there on Zoom. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. We're going to begin with a question for you, Martin, picking up on this series. You have literally reported around the world, and a crisis in Central Asia, in and of itself, is not new. What prompted this series, and what do you hope that the clip that we just saw conveys about the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and what you hope to accomplish in with the series in general?
Well, first of all, thank you to the. Do I have? I'm mic'd. Yeah, they didn't trust me to hold one. So thank you to Northwestern and to the Buffett Institute and to the Central Asia Institute for having and hosting this. It's an honor to be here. I started covering Al-Qaeda 3 years before 9/11, when the African embassy bombings took place in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And so when 9/11 occurred, I'd already made a film about them, and it was natural then to go to Afghanistan and begin to cover the American response. And so I was in Pakistan and Afghanistan early on, and then continued on and made several films there over the years as the Taliban gained strength. And then when I saw the disaster unfolding in our withdrawal, it was pretty much, I knew that I needed to complete the task. And this was America's longest war, and so it made a lot of sense to take 3 hours of television time to try to tell it. It wasn't enough time, but we did the best we could. I think, you know, there are a lot of things that happened when the Taliban resurged and retook Afghanistan, but prominent among those was the repression of women. And as you saw in this clip, the rights being rescinded and the horrible conditions that have continued for these last 2 years, only to get worse. So that was why I was there and what I hope that we got across.
So the Taliban, of course, ruled in Afghanistan in the late 90s through 2001, followed by a gap of over 20 years before resuming power. Najia, Afghanistan changed during those 2 decades. How, if at all, have the Taliban changed? And how are they grappling with Afghanistan today, as opposed to the Afghanistan of the 90s?
Thank you, Susan. And I'm honored to be here with Alice and Martin today. The Taliban oppressive government doesn't change from the 2009, 96 to 2001. They have the same extreme, the same cruel rule as they had before. In 1996 to 2001, the girls were denied education. They were denied employment. They were denied of their basic freedoms. We're watching them today that the same is happening. The woman has the same restriction as they had before. So the Taliban extremist rule had imprisoned half of the populations. They just removed them from the society. They imprisoned them within their homes. In their previous rule, like they were torturing women, and as you saw in the video, that they were beating the woman. They were beating the woman. I remember I was a little kid. I was going with my mom for grocery shops. I remember they were beating the women on the streets. So they are repeating that. The history is repeating looms large. There's no difference between this Talibs and the 1996 Talibs and from 2001. Also, their rule continued during that 20 years that the United States and the international alliance was present in Afghanistan. They showed no regard to the human lives. They killed every civilians. And like they killed the boys and girls in the schools. They killed the mothers, women, and the newborn babies in the hospital. They killed the men in the mosques. They killed the men in the streets and the protests and in the gyms. And also they killed the government employees in the offices, in their cars. So I see no differences. They still torture the women. They are suppressing women's voices. They just, right now it is in Afghanistan, women are kidnapping the protesters, the women who resist against these practices. They kidnap them. They beating them like they do the. Many women are missing right now. So there is no change. I see no change in the Taliban behaviors. I just see that when they came first to the negotiation tables, they showed a very moderate image to the world that we have changed. We're gonna give all the rights to the women, and we're gonna give the rights to the education, the rights to employment, and we're gonna give the basic freedoms for the women under the Sharia law, under the Islamic law. But no one asked them that, what is your interpretation of a Sharia law? Is it different from the previous rule? So no one asked them on that time. So they brought all the restrictions, all the cruelty as before in 1996 to 2001.
You were a domestic violence prosecutor in Afghanistan. You were advocating for women's rights and the human right to live free from fear and free from violence. I'm curious if the words of the activist in the clip that we saw, you'll either get killed or you will succeed, rang true to you, and if your work prior to your coming to the United States was dangerous for you personally.
Of course, it was not only dangerous for me, it was, as I said, it was dangerous for every civilian who was living in Afghanistan. So I grew up in Kabul. I born in Kabul. I grew up in Kabul, and I lived 5 years of my childhood under the Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001. I remember that they denied me, as well as my older sister and other girls, to go to school, and it was really tough. Every day when I was getting out of home and I was getting ready to the office, I was thinking that this would be my last day. I may not return back to the home, because we had the fear of the shooting, we had the fear of the explosion, we were facing different kind of the threat from the Taliban, not from the Taliban, from the criminals, from the powerful peoples who just demanded us or wanted us to give in and to not consent against the appealed court decisions to the Supreme Court. So we were facing different kinds of threats every day. It is true that we either to live or either to succeed. So, and life is worsened right now in Afghanistan. The women who protest, the women who get or raise their voices against this cruelty, they are getting beaten on the public. They are kidnapping. They are missing. Many of the reports. There are many reports that the women are missing, and there's no one knows that what happened to them. So it's really the situation is really hard as this clip.
I recall in 2021 when the Taliban eliminated the Ministry of Women's Affairs and replaced it with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. Ominous. Alice, there are some Americans who believe that the U.S. should not engage in Afghanistan with the Taliban regime at all, that could signify a concession or giving in to their oppression. Your organization works in Afghanistan and has continued to do so. So to what extent have you encountered that sentiment in your work, and how do you respond? And as an add-on, I'm curious if you think that American efforts in the region should continue, and on what terms?
Well, I also just want to thank the Buffett Institute for having Central Asia Institute and for Martin and Najia for coming as well. It's just really exciting to be here. And thank you, all of you, for coming in the afternoon. Yes, we definitely have heard comments like that. I have to say that at Central Asia Institute, we've been very lucky that our supporters and donors have been incredibly dedicated and generous when it comes to Afghanistan. They support everything we do. But when I do encounter people that have that sentiment that, the U.S., should turn away from Afghanistan, I usually have two reasons that I give. The first is the moral imperative. During 20 years, the U.S. had a profound impact on Afghanistan. You are looking at the product of our work, and it's obviously what the Afghan people did themselves, but we have people like Najia, that were educated, that became lawyers, judges, prosecutors. I see friends in this room that also grew up in the last 20 years, became professionals. We educated millions of girls. When the Taliban was overthrown the first time after 2001, there were virtually no girls in school. And when the Taliban came back into power, there were 2.5 million girls in school. So there's a whole generation of Afghans that believed in the principles that we stood for. And those are principles of democracy and human rights and gender equity. And when we walk away, we're turning our backs on our friends and our principles as well. So I feel very strongly that although it's very difficult to engage in Afghanistan today, that in every way we can, we have to stay engaged. The second reason is a more practical and pragmatic one. And that's really for our own, security and, strategic reasons. Before 9/11, Afghanistan was a place that was ungoverned. The Taliban draw power from people who are illiterate and impoverished and have no hope. So when we allow those conditions to return, countries like Afghanistan become a breeding ground for people that don't have any hope, and they're radicalized, and they turn to these terrorist organizations. And we really cannot let that happen again. So I would say those are the two top reasons that I give. And you had an add-on question, but now I can't remember what it was.
Yes, it was whether you think American efforts in the region should continue and under what terms.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, I think they should, but under what terms?
And I'm sorry, let me just clarify that a little bit, Alice. You're operating obviously under the auspices of civil society.
Correct.
But I also was speaking about U.S. government engagement in the region.
Right. I would say, just speaking for myself, not for my organization, that I do think that there are experts within our government on Afghanistan that obviously know, a lot about how the Taliban thinks. The Taliban does not react to pressure from the West. Really, they just don't. You say your people are starving. You can't feed them. You can't provide them health care. They say it's God's will. We won the war. It's God's will. So, I don't have to tell experts within our government that. But they're walking a very difficult line between, on the one hand, being true to the principles of human rights and democracy and gender equity, and then on the other, and not engaging with governments that don't stand for that. And the other is just turning their back entirely on the region. But I do think that organizations like CAI and other organizations that have been supported by Western governments today is an important way to engage, is to make sure that you're not abandoning the people that need support. And right now in Afghanistan, it's one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And the people of Afghanistan, particularly women and children, really need our support right now. And so to work with and through local civil society organizations in Afghanistan that provide this type of assistance, those are the kinds of things that I would advocate are really important right now.
So the moral imperative, the humanitarian imperative, and also the national security imperative. So we are going to see another brief clip from Martin's outstanding docuseries, this one focused on Afghanistan today, taking stock of the changes in the last 2 decades. So panelists, let's move off one more time. 3 minutes.
This is an English book from school. I should know English because it's an international language and it can help me become a doctor in the future.
Secondary schools for girls have remained closed for over a year and a half. 15-year-old Arifa began studying in her living room after the Taliban takeover.
بخاطر که میخوایم در مردم و جامعه کمک کنم و خدمت کنم ما را نمونن که ما درس بخونیم و نمیفهمم کی خواهد بود و که در مردم خود خدمت کنه و کی خواهد بود که در آینده وظیفه های مختلف بگیره، مثلا دکتری، معلمی. وقتی که برادرم مسبک مکتب میرفت و من فکر میکردم که ما دیگر از پیشرفت و بازمانی و ما دیگر عضو افغانستان نیستیم.
The Taliban has officially declared victory in Afghanistan after all U.S. troops left the country.
The last U.S. troops left Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021, officially ending America's longest war. Nearly 2,400 American service members died in Afghanistan. More than 3,900 U.S. contractors also died. Over 115,000 Afghan fighters from both sides were killed, as were nearly 50,000 Afghan civilians. For all the lives and money spent, over $2 trillion, Afghanistan has now regressed to what it was before America came here in the wake of 9/11. It's a pariah state, the only country in the world where women are denied an education, a country where most women cannot go to work, where there are strict dress codes for both women and men, where most music is banned, where scores upon scores of independent news outlets have been shuttered. It's a country where homosexuality can be punishable by death, where a man can be executed and left to hang in the public square.
So, Najia, during your youth in Afghanistan, over the time that you grew up there, the number of girls in primary school increased from essentially 0 in 2001 to 2.5 million in 2018, as Alice referenced. You've described experiencing, witnessing violence against women as a child, walking with your mother. What was it like to be a young woman, to seek the opportunities of education and higher education and the practice of law, and indeed a career seeking gender equity? And I'm curious how your family and your community supported you and viewed girls' education.
Of course. I was born in the civil war in Kabul, and then I lived under the Taliban regime, their first regime in there. I remember that my older sister was not allowed to go to school, while my brothers was allowed to go to school. She was staying at home, and I was lucky that I had a family that they were very supportive to the girls' education. We had a homeschool teachers that my father hired her to teach us at home. So when the Taliban drew away from the power in 2021, I was among those thousands of the girls who found the right to go to the school. And I was a little kid. Because I homeschooling and because of the support of my family, I already could read and write on that time. And it was very challengeable because at the first I remember that we had no schools. There was no schools for the girls. We started our first class in the old buses that it had no windows, no chairs. We were sitting on the ground, and then we even had no boards. So gradually, it was all the obstacles that I found a school with the building when I got in the 9th grade. Before that, we had no schools, we had no classrooms, we had no equipment for the studies. So over all this challenge, I made up my way to the best university in Afghanistan, the American University of Afghanistan, and I got my law degree from there. So, and after a long time in working in different organizations, I just went to the Attorney General Office of Afghanistan as a prosecutor, and then as I got the hire for the director of the elimination of, for the director of investigating and monitoring the women presence in Afghanistan, and then I worked for the elimination of violence against women before the Supreme Court. So I see that, I was seeing that during this 20 years, the people opinion has changed toward the girls' educations. The people's own families were much progressed, and they had the positive view on the women's educations. I have heard many stories from a father that who generously donated his lands to be built a school for the girls. And I have heard many stories of the fathers who was traveling kilometers to take their daughters to the school. So it all shows that how people has changed significantly their view towards the girls' education, because it was a key for the success, and people were supporting girls' education, and still they are supporting, and right now we can see that the Taliban is not facing to a very controlled society, a controlled and illiterate people, but they are facing to very open-minded people, very educated people, that they do not want to stay in that situation. So they have to handle the strict interpretation of the Islamic law, and those people who are modern and who have have a very open-minded view towards the women's rights and girls' rights or education.
Your personal story is, in a sense, mirrored or amplified by Martin's extraordinary docuseries, which I commend to you all. You can go to frontline.org and search it up, America and the Taliban, all 3 hours. Information is power, and we are duly informed and empowered by your extraordinary piece of journalism.
www.frontline.org.
Plug for public television right there. But my question to you as a journalist is, now what? We've seen the state of affairs today. We see the vignettes of the young women who have been able to leave. We've seen the vignettes of the young women who have stayed behind. What do we do with this information?
Well, let me start by responding to some things that Alice was talking about, the question of engagement, which I think is the big issue as to how we deal with this regime. Up till now, the United States government's approach has been what's called the concessionary approach, which is to basically try to extract small concessions from the Taliban in exchange for money or whatever it is that they want or we're willing to give them. And I think this approach is misguided and is not working. because the Taliban are not interested in making the kind of changes that we want them to make. In fact, they derive a certain amount of credibility by resisting us. And I mean, we are the great Satan, to quote the Iranians, but we are the enemy. And to fight against us gives them certain credibility with their people and with jihadist-like states around the region, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Iran. So I don't think that they are going to change by a carrot, a sort of a carrot approach that the US government has been following. And most of the concessions they've made are promises along the lines of providing assurances that they will stop groups from taking root in Afghanistan that might do harm to the West. It has nothing to do with women. Those kinds of concessions, they are not going to make. This is a grand experiment. These mullahs have interpreted the Quran in such a way that they want to carry forward with this experiment that they started in the 90s when they came out of Pakistan and took power, that puts women in the place that you see that they're in. It's a dead end. First of all, even the Saudis realized that you couldn't advance as a modern economy if half the population couldn't drive cars or couldn't have jobs. But that is what the Taliban are pursuing. Now giving various organizations, and that's due to the fact that after the fall of the Taliban, there was a huge famine. Families were selling their daughters in order to get money to feed themselves. So the world is trying to give money. But I just want to say, I think the approach to take, and it's what you do in your work, Alice, is to go around the Taliban. I mean, it's difficult. Alice and I were talking, how do you get money into Afghanistan without going through the Taliban? And helping anybody in Afghanistan, whether it's setting up a school or a small business run by women, is going to benefit the Taliban to some degree. But it has tremendous benefits beyond the negatives. And I think if you can figure out a way to get money in and go to communities and aid people, that's the way to engage, and that's the way to help Afghanistan go around the Taliban. They're a lost cause. They're not going to change, and they may fall of their own accord, but that hasn't happened yet.
And so civil society organizations, NGOs like the Central Asia Institute have persisted and succeeded under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Alice, I'd love to hear how the Central Asia Institute gets it done, some success stories, and maybe also what keeps you up at night.
Well, I have to say that it has not been easy, and we've seen over 2 years now where we keep pivoting and refocusing on what we can do, where can we have an impact, and as the Taliban has slowly closed the door on more and more opportunities for women to get educated, we've had to continue just to refocus on what can we do. We're fortunate in that we support a sector, education, that the Taliban has exempted. Women are allowed to work if they are teachers, and they're allowed to be women healthcare workers. So we support right now close to 8,000 children at the primary level. And these are children that are in very rural, hard to reach areas that previously were out of school. And to Najia's point, there's an enormous demand for that, even in rural areas that we cannot even meet. But we've had to continue to navigate. what has served us well in this time is that from the very beginning in Afghanistan, my organization took an approach where we worked through local civil society organizations. And those organizations, our view was, you should empower people to do this work. And I have to say that's served us really well, because where we work, we, Central Asia Institute, are not being forced to, argue with the Taliban. We have local civil society organizations that are doing that. And even beyond that, we only work where there are communities that want a school. So you have to have a community, including, the mullahs and, the leaders of the community that want their daughters to go to school. So if you already have that, we have two situations where we've heard of where the Taliban had directly tried to intervene in a school. And it wasn't even our partners, it was the community, that negotiated, that pushed back. So we've had to do that. What keeps me up at night is, the millions of girls, like Zara in that film. I mean, I can't watch her, without, wanting to cry, right? She sits there at home alone and, studies by herself. But there are things that give me hope. And the fact that gives me hope is that she is studying at home. She is like Najia before. I mean, she's not giving in. So again, I think that we, in the 20 years we were there, society has changed and people see a vision of their country and women see a vision of themselves that's different. So in that time, you have people that already had to fight very hard, even before the Taliban was in power, to get education. It has not been easy for girls and women to be educated. But they fought for it enormously hard, and they're not going to give in now. So, we have stories like even a third grader who goes home from school every day with her books. She's in primary school, and you're allowed to be educated as a girl up through 6th grade. She goes home every day with her books, and she sits with her mother, and she helps to teach her mother what she learned in school every day, and they're both learning together. So it's those things where I feel like Afghans themselves they have a vision for themselves of who they want to be, and I think, thank God, that they're pursuing that, and they're working very hard for it, and that gives me a lot of hope.
So I promised I would preserve time for Q&A. I'm going to pose one single question to each of you before we open it to the floor. The fight for gender equity is long, seemingly endless, and the road is filled with obstacles, some more insurmountable than others. We have in our audience a Northwestern community and far beyond who are committed to advancing gender equity from local to global. I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Najia, what advice do you have for people who want to contribute to that effort?
The women of Afghanistan suffered a lot. They paid a heavy price in 20 years when the United States and international allies was present in Afghanistan. They paid with the price of losing their loved ones. They lost their kids, their husbands, and their fathers, their brothers. Right now, they are left alone, vulnerable, and they are facing not only restriction on their rights, they are also facing financially. So I feel that the international community has to work toward the improvements of women's rights in Afghanistan, and they should take actions against the Taliban, against the crimes that they are doing for the women of Afghanistan, and they should recognize the crimes against the women in Afghanistan as a gender apartheid, and they should bring the Taliban to the courts to get justice for the women of Afghanistan. They should not leave alone all the women of Afghanistan to suffer alone. So, but we have to note that any improvements on the any success on the improvements of the women's rights in Afghanistan should not lead to give the legitimacy to the cruel rule of the Taliban, to the cruel regime of the Taliban. And because they tasted out, they should not believe anymore, and they should not be trusted. And yeah.
Thank you. Martin?
The folly of their repression of women is enormous. What kind, you say that they can work in healthcare or in education, but what kind of teachers and what kind of nurses or doctors are they going to be if they have stopped getting an education after the 6th grade? There's also a tremendous hypocrisy here in that the leaders of the Taliban send their daughters to schools abroad to get educations. You know, and I confronted them about this, and there is a branch of the Taliban, actually the one with the biggest rewards and terrorist designations, that is actually pro-women's education, the Haqqani network. And they send their daughters away. They've always believed in education, but they're not going to counter the traditional mullahs that are in charge of the country and have a stranglehold on the sort of religious current in the society. They're not going to challenge them because they believe that what they fought for against the Americans was to do it their way. So women are not going to get educations. I had one guy tell me that his smartest kid was his daughter. But unfortunately, God told him that she can't go to school. So she doesn't.
Alice?
Well, I would say that, you know, being here today, all of you showing up today is a way. You show up, right? You're there. You show up. You read the article, you know, in whatever paper you read. You come to events like this. We try to convene events like this, right? You keep talking about it, and you keep talking and reminding Americans, you know, that the fight for gender equality and equality, period, anywhere in the world is still a fight that the vast majority of the world is fighting every day. One thing I've had the privilege of seeing, and you know, all the years I've done this, is how many people around the world fight so hard for the right to be educated. Now, for students who are in this room, you have fought very hard to get where you are today. So you know what it is to really do that. And I would say in your careers, you know, you have to continue to do that, and you're already doing that. I love stories about, you know, when they had banned female newscasters in Afghanistan from going on the air and forced them, well, first I guess they had forced them to cover up, and then all the men newscasters covered up. So they stood in solidarity. The men stood in solidarity with women, and I love those kind of stories. I love stories of, you know, these social media things like Not My Burqa, you know, reminding people that this wasn't Afghan culture. This is not Afghan culture. So I think there are lots of movements in small ways, and I think for young people, particularly in this room, you've got that, right? you guys know how to create a global movement through social media. You know, in Canada, I know that there were girls in school that, you know, had a social media campaign for Afghan girls, just to stand with girls across the world that couldn't go to school. So I think those are the kind of things we have to do. And remember, we are in a global world, and you know, we have to be engaged in the world.
Be engaged and leverage digital communications to amplify your voice. The conversation is not yet over, but I do need to call it here. I invite you to join me for refreshments and to continue the conversation just through those doors. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.